This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances, the podcast where we take you down the rabbit hole into the fantastic world of the strange,
Come
paranormal,
along with us on this
and the
week's
unknown.
adventure.
I'm Morgan Knudsen.
And this time we're venturing into the mind, of course.
Yeah, with Howard Eisenberg, Dr. Howard Eisenberg, and his really cool book, Dream It to Do It, The Science of Magic. And I loved this concept and I loved this title because, you know, we talk a lot about psychokinesis and we talk about the idea that, you know, our reality isn't really what it seems. And this is exactly what he talks about in this book, is that our experience maybe isn't what we think it is on the surface.
Yeah, things are never what they first appear to be.
I love where he goes in this book, and we'll talk to him about this a little bit, but the idea that scientific discoveries were not the result, as he says, of the linear step-by-step scientific method of research, but rather emerged from mental imagination and intuitive feelings, quoting his book. I think many people will hate this because they want to see it the other way around. But this is something that I think really is important to understand about science and about how things come about in the world. And he breaks it down so well, and makes this super practical for people to understand that yeah, our imagination, everything starts from imagination. So when we talk about parapsychology and we talk about the paranormal, no matter what subject we're talking about, this is it. This is where it starts.
Well, let's get into this conversation with Dr. Eisenberg.
Let's do it. Well, this is really exciting because this is one of our favorite topics, Mike. Howard, it is great to have you because this is just really exciting. We just love to have this conversation. So welcome to Supernatural Circumstances.
Thank you. And I love talking about this subject too. I can't even think more important, especially right now in the world.
Oh gosh, yeah. Like what's so great about this subject right now, which is something that I really love, is that like this stuff is really life-changing when you start to absorb and understand the level of power in our reality that we actually have.
Yeah.
And that to me is just, it's so important for the now. We can talk about that in a little bit. But, you know, everybody's had their own journey to this information. I know Mike and I have as well.
Mm-hmm.
How did it start for you?
For you ask me questions, I can go really deep and wide. So feel free to rein me in. But as a child, I just had a natural curiosity. Again, for me, it was a natural curiosity, perhaps, prematurely, given my age, of just how things work. Like, why are we here? What's kind of the meaning of this all? And why do people have different religions and they each think theirs is the right one and everybody else is the wrong one? So I started at a very early age just, wondering about those things. And then around 12, adolescence, I found out about science fiction books, particularly at that time, space science fiction. And just loved, stretching my imagination, reading those books. And then shortly afterwards, I became aware that some of the things I was reading about in the science fiction books, which is not supposed to be about reality, it's fiction, it's imagination, were actually happening in our world. Like, for example, as I read books on space travel, there was no space travel, there was no space program, there were no rockets that sent anything into space. But yet these books were describing that, and even the cover art often showed astronauts in spaceships or space stations before we ever had them. And so that really resonated with me. I thought, like, wow, they, with just imagination, went to a place in the future that eventually became a reality, that manifested, so to speak. And then I became curious, is there anyone doing like serious research on this, doing the connection of our mind, consciousness, imagination, and so-called external material reality? And I found out about the research of Dr. J.B. Ryan down in North Carolina. He was one of the pioneers of parapsychology as a science in the United States, and in some ways internationally as well. And I actually met him at one point, and decided I really wanted to do serious research on this at an academic level. And when I was going to graduate school in psychology, I was doing a joint degree with medicine, which was difficult to achieve the university's permission to do both programs simultaneously. But once they did, I sort of had broken through a dam of previous patterns, and I proposed doing research on telepathy, which was hearsay back there. This was McGill University. At the time, the chairman of that department was the famous D.O. Hebb, who's sometimes considered now, the father or grandfather of neuroplasticity. He was also former president of the American Psychological Association, but he had said a few decades previously and stated in one of the AP journals that he rejected all of the evidence for psychic phenomena in parapsychology because it was a priori impossible, and that's the word he used. In other words, that was theoretically impossible, so I consider it. So I decided, crazy young person that I was, I'm going to do this research, and I'm going to do it in his department. And I did. And it was extremely successful. And an interesting, kicker on this, it was his secretary who ended up typing up my thesis. And periodically I would go in, if there were typos or some misunderstanding, pretty sloppy writing for a doctor. It was beginning. It's worse now. But back then, there was an occasion when I was talking to her about some final proofreading, and Professor Hebb himself walked out of his inner office. She was his secretary. And she said to him at that point in front of me, Professor Hebb, you've been wrong. ESP is real, and this research proves it. Well, a year or two later, he recanted in public. And I, even in my own book, Dreaming to Do It, I have a quotation that, again, is in print in one of the journals, where he explicitly says, he was wrong, and that the evidence is convincing. There is something there, even though he didn't understand how it relates to other things we know. So that, is a brief, accelerated description of how I got into this. And then I went on to become a medical doctor, which I still am, specializing in psychiatry, psychotherapy. I also developed a consulting practice internationally, Magic Consulting, and would teach people how to, so to speak, think out of the box, creative thinking, innovation, which now is requisite, but back then it was very pioneering. That became quite successful, that and also my medical practice. So I left behind my official participation in the realm of parapsychology until a few years ago, when I received an invitation from an old friend to be the keynote speaker at an annual conference of a group of therapeutic touch practitioners, so-called, in biblical terms, laying on of hands. And they felt they could heal with their energies or help people heal as they shared their energies with those patients in need. And they invited me to revisit the field after some decades had passed, and I was more into my, again, medical practice and my consulting practice. The interest was still there, but I wasn't pursuing it actively. Well, I accepted the invitation, and to honor it and do it credit, I did an extremely deep dive into all of the literature about my first book came out 50 years ago, Inner Spaces, Parapsychological Explorations of the Mind. So I literally went back almost over half a century of research since I had published that book, and I was also teaching this at a course at the University of Toronto. And also took a very deep dive into the latest developments in physics, quantum mechanics. I took a deep dive into the indigenous culture teachings all over the world. I took a deep dive into comparative religions and looked at what is in common to these religions, as in part Aldous Huxley did in his wonderful book, The Perennial Philosophy, instead of which religion is the right one, which are similar. One way of sorting it all out is to look at what's in common to all of the major religions. And that, of course, is, as you know, in part, there's more than one dimension to reality, and there is a level at which we and everything is connected. So I'm going through this again academically, this research on my own, aided at this point in my life with a computer, and also going into anthropological studies, looking at the latest understanding of brain function with MRI scanning, looking at what was emerging now that the doors are opening somewhat progressively with psychedelic research and psychiatry, and what they were finding when they do brain scans, finding, for example, that when you do a brain scan of somebody on these psychedelic drugs, in most cases, instead of the brain being, revved up and hyperactive, it's the opposite. It quiets down. It gets out of the way. And so I was fascinated, like connecting all this. And as I said in my book, Treatment to Do It, what I did is I connected all the dots. This is intellectual, but all of a sudden, unexpectedly, as I'm going through and collecting this information and connecting the dots, I suddenly experienced a flip of my reality. It was during the day. I was totally conscious, not taking any type of substances and alone, just doing this research. And suddenly I had a very, very deep realization, insight, or maybe a revelation that my whole understanding of reality, of science, was totally wrong. It was absolutely in the wrong direction because of the culture we live in right now, which we've been brought up to believe, teaches us there's an external physical world that exists independently of us. And through random processes, physical evolution over eons of time, somehow we emerged into being and with consciousness. And I realized that when you look at quantum mechanics and you look at the ancient mystical teachings, which are very similar, strangely enough, it suggests something very different. That the outer world, as they say, in the Hindu traditions, Maya, it's illusion. Yes, you see it, you experience it, but it's illusion. I mean, when you're in dreams, you also experience things. But when you wake up, you realize it was illusion. It's just a dream. I realized, too, that going back to my medical background, my scientific background, and the deep dive I was doing into all the data in neuroscience that had emerged in the last half century, that there was still, believe it or not, no real evidence that the physical head brain produces our consciousness. There's not even an accepted theory to explain the possibility of how the physical material brain could give rise to immaterial subjective consciousness. So I realized it wasn't science. It was because scientism, when you just believe in something because of historical precedents, because of perhaps peer pressures or fear, really revealing what you really think, speaking your truth. So that's a quick dump on your question of how did I get into this?
I love the book. I've read it a couple of times. It is just, it's so well done. And it's so palatable for people who are new to this as well, which I really love, because this is becoming more and more, I think people are becoming more and more interested in exactly what this is. They're sort of putting aside this idea that this is all some kind of pseudoscience, which it is not. And, and people are beginning to understand that there's more to it. There was one part in your book that I thought was so interesting, which was you proposed something really significant to your students, which was prove that we're not dreaming right now. Can you talk about this a bit? Because I loved this question.
Yeah, and not only with my students, like at the university, but also in my public speaking to other audiences as well.
Yeah,
and my colleagues, and none of them, not one to this day, has been able to give me a definitive answer to that. So the point is that I go from that. If no one can be certain that they're not in this moment in a dream, because again, when we're in a dream, often it seems realistic until we awaken, then we can't be certain about anything, because dreams are about imagination. And if we don't even know if we're in a dream, how can we have certainty about anything? With one exception, and that goes back to Descartes. We're aware.
Yeah.
And even if you try to doubt your awareness, you're still aware.
Oh yeah, that's big. That's big. I got goosebumps. This idea as well that people are so good at translating our physical reality that we just believe our experience instead of the opposite, which is like we experience what we believe. And and I love this concept because we're so accurate, and our perceptions are so tuned to the idea that everything that we see and think or think we're touching and moving around is something that's real, but physical reality is really just is probability. It's imagined.
It is very much to underline that. It's imagined. In fact, as I did a deep dive, as I mentioned before for this keynote presentation a couple of years ago, I looked also at believe it or not, the history of invention, both, in terms of scientific developments like Mendeleev's periodic table of elements. It's pretty high, sophisticated chemistry, but it's foundational. Nikola Tesla's discoveries, which are the foundation still today of our modern electrical technology around the world. And he did all of his invention work in his mind, visually. He would imagine it. He wouldn't only imagine the devices he eventually created, he even imagined doing simulations of them as if you could turn on the switch and see how it operates. Does it work? Does it need some fine tuning? And back, I think around the 1940s, believe it or not, he even anticipated, he wrote about this in print, he even anticipated the development of a smartphone. He said there will be a pocket-sized device, which phones are these days, and it will allow you to instantaneously be in contact, both with speech and visually, with anyone in the world.
Yeah, look at that.
That's in the 1940s.
That's amazing.
So the truth is, if you really look at how science has developed, it really has been working with imagination. Even Einstein, one of our most famous scientists, in terms of certainly physics, but even some of his other work as well, and his philosophical teachings, which most people aren't aware of, but they're quite brilliant and wise. He started his investigation of sort of the cosmos, how reality works, at the tender age of 16, by imagining himself riding a beam of light through the universe and how that would change what he would experience. That was the root of what he went on to develop with his theory of relativity, E=mc² squared, famous formula. But it's true of all of them.
Yeah.
It all started with imagination. Even Stephen Jobs of, Apple fame, he was deeply interested, as you may know, in meditation and also psychedelics. In fact, much of the development in Silicon Valley these days is somewhat lubricated with psychedelics. And I don't mean for stress management. I mean for creativity, for insight, for juicing up imagination.
I don't think many people that kind of hang their hopes on scientism understand the depth of this. We recently had on a guest, Craig Wheeler. We were talking about just how hard some of these groups cling to this to these ideas, and it was so interesting how in your book when you talked about the famous New Age author Peter Russell, and how can something as immaterial as consciousness arise from something as unconscious as matter. And that really struck me, because it's like, well, wait a minute, you're right. This is unconscious. So what is going on here? How do you answer that question?
Well, in terms of what's going on, again, I told you I can go deep.
We're going there.
I'll try and contain it a bit. So let me come back to what I said about the frequency that most of us have dreams. And many of us, at least at some point in our life, have dreams in which, while we're in it, it seems totally real until we wake up. So if the external world is illusion, if everything ultimately comes from imagination, my understanding, and I have to speak metaphorically, symbolically when I explain this to you, is that what has traditionally been called God is like, if you like, the divine dreamer. And we're all in the dream. Just sort of like Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage, and we have our players on it. And why would we be dreamed up by God? I like to use other sources because there's so much misunderstanding and even hostility about other foreign religions. And so much confusion. In Christianity alone, I was doing my research, there's over 45,000 denominations of Christianity currently in the world, just in Christianity. And as you know, there's many other religions with other, divisions and sects. So it's a really, deep thing to look at in terms of how do you get clear of all the noise, the popular teachings, the historical teachings, the different cultural and ethnic teachings. How do you come to clarity to understand based on real experience, something that can also be, by the way, testable, going back to, in part, parapsychology research, when it's done properly. And so this is what I've come up with, connecting the dots. If you think of God, and again, I like to use the word source these days. In my book, I use the word universal mind. If you think of everything coming from the source, and the source being conscious, going back to Descartes, why would it, if it also was sort of omnipotent and omnipresent and all those things that we've been taught about traditionally about God in many religions, why would it want to, so to speak, dream us up? If it knows everything, controls everything, why would it want us? And why would it even want to create the universe? And my answer is this. On one level, philosophically and logically, to have consciousness, awareness, you have to have something you can be aware of, conscious of. So in a strange way, even though everything comes from this God consciousness, from source, we're also needed for source to have a greater and fuller expanding awareness, strangely, of itself. I'll give you an analogy to this to explain it in some conventional terms in a way. Currently, in our external level reality, and I like to think of it as levels of reality, Dr. Charles Tart referred to this as consensual reality, where we all have some agreement, we're having somewhat similar experiences and orientation and beliefs. When you look at reality from your experience and you open yourself up intuitively, you're able to access a whole other level of awareness, which is not so segmented and restricted, and you're not as caught up in distractions, and you have more clarity. So coming back to this analogy, so we here on this consensual reality, as I think we're talking about this level right now, where we're physical and separate, it seems, we have right now, as you know, in, for example, America, a space program. And we have a space station in orbit. And there are astronauts right now on that space station. Now, again, we're here on Earth. I'm talking about still this level of, again, our reality. To me, it's only one level. And it's somewhat, again, a more superficial and illusory level, but nevertheless, it's part of our reality. On this level, we have people on Earth who are in communication through our telecommunications technologies with people in the space station who are able to observe things and measure things and do experiments and relay that information back to us here on Earth. Right. So again, humans have extended themselves beyond this level, the Earth, to another level. In this case, again, it's a Gable space station, but it could also be, on the moon, because they've also, as you know, been on the moon. Sure. And it expands our awareness here on Earth in this frame of reference of what's going on, so to speak, in the greater world out there, outside of the Earth, in so-called outer space. So the analogy here is that by God dreaming us up and having total access to any of our experiences because we're coming from that source, it provides an enrichment. It provides more stimulation.
Yeah.
Again, if I can come back to an analogy in terms of, well, why would this be this way? If you as a human being, even if you liked a certain, let's say, program on television or a particular website, podcast, whatever you're following, if, however, subsequently the same broadcast, the same podcast or source was repeatedly the same one you would see whenever you would try to go to something for, a refresher, something new, something better perhaps. But all you would get is the same thing over and over again, even though at first you really were interested and attracted to it. Eventually it would be a turnoff, and perhaps it would become noxious, somewhat unpleasant.
Sure.
So we as humans need this variety in our life to be reasonably happy, healthy, and balanced. And so does Source. Source needs us to be conscious of. Source needs us to expand its own awareness. Still following me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. And
very much so.
yeah, I mean, this is, Mike, you and I, we've talked about this before, just this idea that expansion is really the go-to of the universe. It is always looking. It always seems to be looking for these experiences that we've even heard channelers talk about this before, where we're on the leading edge. This is the leading edge, and every thought we think, everything that we're projecting, it's expansive of more and more and more, and that's kind of the rule of the universe.
Exactly. And although it's expansive, if you want to call it sort of the rule of the universe or how it works, but it's not divisive.
Yes.
There's still that, sense of common unity, common ground. However, we in this dimension as apparently separate beings, humans, egos, we think we're separate from each other physically in totality, as long as, somebody's actually touching us in some way. And certainly separate from our physical environment. We're aware of it, but it's outside of us. And right now in our world, this goes back partly why I wrote my book, by the way, Morgan, just recently, because I felt everybody had to. I think our world's going in the wrong direction big time. In physics, we call this entropy, where you have a tendency towards greater disorder over time. Mm-hmm. So when I look at the world broadly, and I mean broadly, so I'm talking here in North America, but I'm also talking very much what's going on right now in Europe with the war in Ukraine, going on in the Middle East with that war, what has just recently happened with the COVID pandemic, and still emerging, new viruses, the possible demise of American democracy in just several months. I won't go into it further, but you know what I'm talking about. The breaking of alliances, the disaffection of many people from traditional religions. Many of the churches, as you know, are so empty they have to sell them off right now. No one's using them anymore for these reasons. The increasing rates in our surveys of people feeling extremely anxious and confused about these times. The increase from a clinical point of view of anxiety and depression disorders, even suicide. The imminent threats we're facing, and we're already dealing with some of the consequences of global climate change, even though there's still some people who are doubting that. It's a very sad reality. The fact that there's microplastics everywhere in the world, including in polar caps. When I look at all this together, I repeat, it's all going in the wrong direction. Why is it going in the wrong direction? Because it's about divisiveness, contrary to our unitary background. And it's about overly being distracted by what seems out there, mm-hmm. as opposed to being, again, able to access, I said earlier, intuitively, the greater awareness within us. So, for example, in the Bible, as you may know, there's a line saying, be still and know God.
Yeah.
And when you still your mind through perhaps just, your disciplined practice, or more formally, perhaps through a meditation practice, you actually can touch, without any medications, any drugs, any special environment, a different level of reality. And I believe more the primary level reality from where everything really comes.
It's interesting as well as that, we were talking about this sort of disconnection that everybody's mm-hmm. been observing. I mean, Mike and I, you and I would talk about this pretty often.
Yeah.
And just this lack of going inward, exactly what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
This lack of being in touch with something. No, I think number one, something greater than us. I think that's a big part of it.
Yes.
And not necessarily in the form of religion, but in the form of just understanding that inner connection. Because I know there's been a number of people in my life that have just lost that sense of interconnection so greatly that I've lost the friendship with them because they've just become so disconnected.
Sad but true.
It's so true. And I think one of the most important parts in your book, which many people will be going, what the hell, is apparently like less brain work equals greater consciousness. And I think that is dead on.
And it's so contrary to not only what most people believe popularly, but even, scientists and physicians.
Sure.
But it's true.
Yeah.
And also, if we play with the level of, say, again, conventional reality, this level of reality where it seems physical, even the understanding that people have today popularly and or repeat professionally too in the realm of medicine, The head brain is only one of the physical brains we humans have. We have at least two others. We have a heart brain and we have a gut brain.
Yeah.
Coming back to the heart brain just for a moment, the heart has neurons like the head brain does, brain cells. The heart has its own memory system. The heart has more nerves going up that can modify the head brain function than our brain in our head can affect the heart.
That's incredible.
The heart can also secrete the love hormone, oxytocin. The heart also appears to be sort of more of a channel, more of a connection again to that inner, deeper realm. Some of the work at right now, Institute of Heart Math, has been doing some very good research showing that the heart seems to allow us informationally, awareness-wise, to access a whole other level and a much more important level. And even if we go back to biblical teachings, like the Bible, God is love, or the wisdom of the Golden Rule, treat others as you'd have them treat you, because it's all really fundamentally connected. There's so many, other ways. Going back to my expression, I was connecting the dots in both coming up with this understanding, but also in writing the book so other people can now understand it. And I think it's crucial to understand it. You said earlier, and I think it was really well put, Morgan, that we experience what we believe. So to take an example from my background in medicine, many people are familiar with something we call the placebo effect. Some people call it sugar pills. And that means you're given a substance by a doctor or nurse with the expectation that it's a medication of some sort for something that's bothering you, some ailment you have. And the reality is, though, it's what we call chemically inert. It's not that medication, and that's why I use the expression sugar pill. It's just something very simple, but it has no profound effect that could help cure you of any condition or change your physiology. And if people believe, however, they're getting a real medication, and maybe one of the new leading edge ones that has advantages over the ones that have been out before, then many of them will have a very positive therapeutic response, even though it's not from the chemical, from their belief.
Yeah.
But it's also the converse. If some people have had problems with, let's say, side effects from other medications, or they've read something to make them fearful of some new medications coming out, or they don't fully trust the doctor or the nurse giving them, this medication. So if they have some fear, not only does it not help them therapeutically in a positive way, it actually causes what we call negative side effects. They may break out in a rash. They may have a headache. They may feel faint, etc. All from imagination. So yes, so again, what you believe determines not just what you, are aware of and experience, but in a sense, what becomes real.
Yeah.
And that goes back in some ways, if you like, the whole area, controversially as it is, of manifestation, which can be real. There are so many peddlers of mistruth right now for their own, financial gain out there, as you know, and just to maybe have an influence and control over other people. But manifestation is real.
Yeah.
I can hypnotize somebody and ask them to imagine that I'm touching them with a very hot item, a probe or something, that I heat it up. And where I touch their skin, I can do this with my finger or the end of a ballpoint pen. I've done it in different ways. Within a few moments, a wheel forms as if there really was a burn. But there wasn't. It was just their imagination. But it caused physical change within minutes. That's just one, slight example of it. Again, it is mind over matter, big time.
I believed for years and years that, the world was, I was a very negative person in a past life, I would say. But I believed for years that the world was against me. There were things conspiring against me. I was born at the wrong time to the wrong people, all of those kind of things. And as a result, I received exactly that. I received,
what you believed, right?
Yeah. What I believed was what was holding me back. I didn't realize that it wasn't anything external to me. It was all an inside job, as we say.
Mindset, we sometimes refer to it as. And that's the prime thing as a psychotherapist today I work on with patients. I don't use medications, almost never. I just help them become more aware. And in that awareness, discover there's more choice. They don't have to be as they were. They don't have to just reactively and passively, experience life. It can be more of their choosing, more of their own fashioning.
I see this all the time, especially in parapsychology. When I was still taking clients and things like that, I always thought it was so fascinating how people would, they'd come with what they believed was this problem, usually some form of haunting or psychokinesis or something that was going on. And it every single time came back to A, their perception, and B, stuff that they had going on. Like if they were having a negative experience with this phenomenon, every single time it came back to unhealed stuff that they hadn't cleaned up, or there was chaos in the family. I recently had very dear friends of mine go through this, but their life was very, very chaotic, and everything that they were experiencing around them was a reflection of the chaos that they had going on. And they were so, I think, desensitized to it because it had been going on so long that they didn't recognize that it was just all of a sudden this crazy stuff was happening. But it really, I find there's almost no better reflection of exactly what we're talking about than these scenarios, because it's like, if you want to see where your dysfunction is, look around you. Look around you. You'll be able to pinpoint, where the errors in thought are, because of it, everything just will get reflected back. And it's a really, really interesting thing to me. But one thing I wanted to point out as well, and that really grabbed me in your book, was this idea of a virtual reality fail-safe.
Yes.
And I loved this concept because I don't think a lot of other books have discussed this. Can we talk about that a little bit? Yeah, because this is really interesting.
As an aside, too, if I had the time and energy and resources, there's another book that I'm working on broadly speaking, sort of ego management. Because one of the things that blocks our greater awareness is our ego.
Yeah.
Our ego gives us a sense not only of separation, but of some fear of things that are different and we don't understand, like, other religions, so to speak, or ethnicities or races or ideologies. But it also fuels us in a competitive way to not only want to survive, but exceed what perhaps we currently have or other people have around us, to get more and more. And the more we get, sadly, the more we want. And the more insensitive we become to others who have so much less, and in some cases, who we may even be exploiting. So the ego itself, our sense of this is me, this is my life, I can do whatever I want to do. There are no consequences I have to really concern myself with, as long as I, follow, let's say, the laws of the land. It's very, very limiting. It's almost like we call tunnel vision. It's very restricted awareness of how things could be so much better and so much different. Right now, as you may know, and this is global in the world, many people are complaining to a very deep degree of loneliness. In fact, in the United Kingdom and in Japan, both federal governments have appointed ministers of loneliness. They take it that seriously. Also in the U.S., the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has written a book about the epidemic of loneliness that we're experiencing right now. A large part of that is fueled again by ego, our sense of being separate beings, amplified greatly by social media, which captures our attention. It's addictive for many people and very misleading. Takes you very much away from your inner ability to connect to that deeper intuitive level of truth and goodness. So that's the main one. There are other levels, and it comes out in different ways. So, for example, back on parapsychology, as you may know, historically, and still somewhat currently, many of the mainstream respected scientific journals would refuse to even take into consideration publishing research that seemed to show positive findings in parapsychology on psychic phenomena. And this has been a huge block. Many university departments will not allow their faculty members to do research in this area at all. So you have that societal pressure. And I think part of that is also coming back to the fail-safe. It's a composite of different things. I've expanded it since I wrote about my book, but I do talk about the examples in my book, as you know, as you're referencing right now. So there's fear of keeping up, of getting ahead, or other people, bypassing, or losing your position, and so on. So the emotional part, besides ego, fear of potential consequences of, speaking your truth, of going against the grain, that also holds us back. And then, as I mentioned, the censorship, literally, that prevents some of this information coming out more fully. And then you could look at, well, who maybe has an interest in keeping us in the dark, not as knowledgeable as we could be. And I have to admit, I have a lot of concern these days with the development of artificial intelligence and some of the particular people who are in charge right now of developing and rolling it out. Because as I see it, it's going to create even more divisiveness. It's going to downgrade our sense of having any positive ability for good thinking, to make good decisions, and even make us more dependent on external sources of information rather than in internal intuition and working with our imagination. So it's a composite. When I say fail-safe, I mean, again, these are things that relatively prevent most of us from knowing what we're speaking of right now, that there's another realm of consciousness, much deeper, more unitary, from which everything emerges. It's keeping us from that awareness.
Yeah,
but it's not like how should I say that it's insurmountable. There's expression, knowledge is power, and it's even more so awareness is power. So once you have greater awareness, you're more aware of other choices. But some of us now are so distracted by what's out there, and as I said, it's particularly amplified by social media. We could even show correlation graphs of the incidence of depression, anxiety, and this loneliness with the popularization of the cell phones and particularly social media. It's a direct correlation. The more popular they became, the more people have been suffering from these conditions. Many people now, not just on social media, but even on various news channels, as you know, are so confused about what is real out there, even though this is only one level of reality, that they're very vulnerable for all these conspiracy theories. But back to my point, who profits, who benefits on this level from keeping us in the dark? Well, some of the very wealthy people in the world, the so-called 1%, it's kind of in their interest to have us as kind of naive, passive consumers of their products and services, and to keep us naive. Just like, junk food. If you didn't know better and you really thought, well, there's a junk food place nearby, it's fast food, it's cheap, it's kind of predictable in terms of what it will taste like and look like. If you didn't know better and all you eat that, it's obviously not good for your health, your well-being. And it's not in the interest of restaurants that serve fast foods or those who make the products to advertise that it's not in your interest of personal wellness to indulge in these things, at least, frequently.
Sure, so yeah, I would agree.
Fail-safe also has a political element to it these days.
Yeah, no, and it's correct. I mean, we see it in Canada. We're both in Canada, so we see it here as well.
Oh, I thought you were in the U.S. for some reason.
Yeah, no, yeah, we're both Canadians, but
Canucks.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, we're Oilers fans here.
Yes. Well, Morgan is an Oilers fan.
Well, you have to be too now. They're going to the Cup. I'm just saying. Just saying. I got to get that in there. But yeah, like this is a big thing because we're taught, I think, from a very early age that that there's this sort of external world that comes after us that is we are beholden to this external world. Whatever happens, and we're taught that as kids. At the beginning we're taught dream big, you can be whatever you want to be, but then as soon as you get older it's like no, don't do that because you're not going to make any money with the arts, or you're not going to make any money. So right away, right, it starts to be cut down. And one of the studies that I really loved in Dream It to Do It was Dio Heb, when he described the phenomenon of infants born with congenital cataracts and received corrective surgery. This study to me is so interesting. Can we talk about this a little bit?
Yeah. So what he found is that infants, babies, who were born with a visual block, a cataract, so they couldn't have clear vision, clear sight, and then subsequently later on in life, several years later in some cases, had it corrected surgically, as we do in sometimes adults when they have cataracts and replace the lens. So now they could see properly as we understand it in the physical sense of the optics of it, but they didn't see what we saw. So if there was a chair in front of them, for example, they didn't see the chair as a thing in front of them, let alone understanding you could sit on it. So they had to learn to see things separately, to understand how things could be arranged differently, spatially, how to navigate physically with vision and educate it so they wouldn't be bumping and tripping all the time. In other words, once, in a sense, the truth of vision was revealed to them through the surgical correction of the cataract surgery, they did not see what we call, the true reality. They had to be taught that. And more fundamentally, that was really good science to point this out, but more fundamentally, in a way, that's what's going on in the world for all of us right now. You're born in a particular culture, perhaps with a particular religion, perhaps with a particular, ideology, value system. And for many of us, that shapes your whole life. But it's somewhat arbitrary. It's just what you've been taught and perhaps encouraged and maybe even pressured into believing and doing. But it's not necessarily at all what serves your really better interests, and for all of us.
Yeah, we had a guest on not that long ago talking about the phenomenon and the development of flying saucers, and this reminded me so much of that, because what we ended up discussing was that flying saucers weren't actually seen by people until somebody, basically someone in the press, made a mistake about a very famous encounter and misprinted the information about this fellow's description of his encounter. And it was so interesting because after that, everybody was seeing flying saucers, right? Everybody was seeing these flying saucers, including, interestingly enough, our guest as well. And it's because he was by far not a non-believer or anything like that, but he found it very intriguing that immediately our perception was changed. And of course, at that point, nobody knew it was a misprint. Everybody thought, well, this article is accurate, and that's the description of what this man saw. He saw a flying saucer, when in fact, that's not what he said. And it was, to me, that was so profound that something like that can literally shape our perception. And I think what people don't realize often is that not only is it shaping our perception, but it's actually creating the reality of it.
Yes.
And that, I think, is where people are, they struggle. They say, sure, or we might see blue as purple or something like that. But this isn't that. This is something that is actually physically created in our reality because of that, like you say, that sort of dream state.
Manifestation, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, just to pull this all together for people, it's so much, right? It's so much. That's what we love about this. It's such a huge topic. But how do you think that, like, after people listen to this conversation, how do you think people can use this day to day? How can people begin to apply this information now for themselves?
Well, I don't know, in all honesty, from just listening to us, that would be totally sufficient. You mentioned you read my book now twice, and as you may have realized, it's unusually deep and data dense. In fact, I don't know of any other book at all that has as much data in it, and it's concise. As you know, it's not a padded book. So actually, I encourage people to read the book, not just to read it, but read it really slowly. And actually, as you did, without my advice, correctly, with your intuition guiding you, read it more than once.
Yeah.
It's very deep. And what I say and what I share in the book has nothing to do with faith.
Yeah.
It's all about what you can know by yourself, experientially, to know the truth yourself. And it guides you as to how to do that, how to make meaning out of all of this. and how to access it. Now, if people, back to your question, if they take that dive into the book, there's also an audio recording, as you may know, of my book as well, so it's on audio. If they take that deeper dive and see how the dots connect, and with that awareness, feel more empowered to live and shape a different type of life.
Yeah,
They
and
can. They can.
Absolutely.
Once you have awareness, you're also aware of choices, of possibilities. And as I've said a few times now, everything ultimately comes out of imagination. So when you're wary of other choices, you can imagine different things. And as you said correctly, we experience what we believe. And so if you learn to work with your conscience, with your mind, and this requires some self-discipline as well, you can so transform your life, even if it's just for, health conditions. I mean, there are many examples now in the medical literature of so-called miracle cures. Not only miracle cures in the sense that someone went to a faith healer who, treated them with energies and so on. I mean, people who just had a different awareness and realization in the midst of some serious illness with a very bad prognosis, woke up to an awareness. They don't have to just be passive in that process, and totally reverse the course of the illness. And were cured by themselves.
Yeah, this is information is a big deal. And that's why Mike and I were so passionate about it, because it's, people think, well, I could get myself a new car, or I could get myself, well, yeah, you could, but there's more implications to this. And it is absolutely profound understanding. And it's so empowering for everybody that's out there that is feeling like everything is falling apart around them.
Yeah, that's right.
That this can start to turn your life around. And it really does.
Yeah.
It really, really does. And the book for everybody, it's Dream It to Do It, The Science of the Magic. It's absolutely phenomenal. If you're interested in going down this road, this is a really great place to start. Howard, where can people find you, and where can they find the book?
Well, I have a website, drhowardeisenberg.com, Dr. Howard Eisenberg's with an E, drhowardeisenberg.com. And as far as accessing the book, it's essentially online, unless they order it through the bookstore. They can order it. But the easiest way to get it is online. Here in Canada, Chapters Indigo, Amazon, in the world broadly, Amazon, and the U.S. also Barnes & Noble. So it's mostly online, but anyone who knows the title of it could go to any local bookstore and ask them to order it, and they will.
Great.
No, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. This information is, and for people out there too, I think, this information is the core of parapsychology. If people are wondering what this has to do with the paranormal,
Mm-hmm.
This is the core of parapsychology. This is everything that everybody's experiencing, whether it be, the UFO phenomenon or telepathy or ESP or psi, whatever it is. This is it. This is the fundamentals. Yeah. This is where you start.
Exactly.
I had somebody email me yesterday just asking, where do I want to go on this journey. Where do I start? And A, it starts with you. And B, it begins with this fundamental stuff. And so it's like people that want to get into these other areas, start here, because this is it. So thank you so much.
And as you know, in my book, I don't only, connect the dots and share this information, but I also provide exercises so people can test it out within minutes for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool. So cool. Thank you so much for coming today. This has been great.
Thank you for your interest. Thank you.
Oh, it's been wonderful. And we hope to have you back at some future point to keep this going.
Maybe we'll see each other next time.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe. Oh, good. Thank you, Howard.
Stay well. Thank you again, both, for your interest.
Alrighty, now that we've wrangled a cat, let's get into having a bit of a discussion about Dr. Eisenberg's interview. What a great guy. I really like Howard.
Yeah, he's great. And I love how he's able to make this stuff really accessible for people. Some of the things that he touched on, like our individual perceptions are not caused by an independently existing physical reality, the out there. We talked about this a little bit before with Dr. Evan Alexander as well, that the out there is not as out there as what we think, that we're not who we think we are.
And the out there is not really out there. It's more in there. which
It's in there.
and the out there is in there.
Like, how fun is this? And this is the thing I love about the paranormal in general, is that people forget to have fun with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what a lot of this is about. And, he talks about the only thing that you can personally know for certain at this moment is that we're experiencing awareness.
Yeah.
And the basis for these breakthroughs is about connecting back in with that awareness. So this is accessible for everybody. We can all do this, which is really fascinating. And I loved how at the beginning of the conversation, I talked to him about this idea of prove we're not dreaming right now. And I thought his answer was brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that, we can't really put our finger on that. Like, what makes this reality different than something else? And I don't know. I love this rabbit hole. It's so cool.
Yeah. There's a really great book that I read many, many years ago. And it's called, If You Meet Buddha on the Road, Kill Him. The Pilgrimage of Psychotherapy Patients. And essentially what it is
wow.
It says that this guy, Sheldon B. Kopp, says that no meaning comes from outside of ourselves. No meaning that comes from outside of ourselves is real. The Buddhahood of each of us has already been obtained. We only need to recognize it.
Wow.
Right?
That's a lot.
It's a lot, yes.
It's a lot, but it's really cool. I loved, speaking of that, I loved how Dr. Eisenberg talked about, that human minds have a fail-safe to protect us from that, virtual reality,
Mm-hmm.
almost like a virtual reality cover from being exposed, right? Like that, like your book was saying that this fail-safe is really that convincing that we can't really quite wake up from it.
Yeah.
It's very Matrix. It's very Matrix.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's so neat.
That's what I was just thinking. Totally Matrix reference. It's like the red pill or the blue pill. I don't want any pills. Just stay away from me with the pills.
Yeah, well, it's true though. Like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I've found that over the years, and what interestingly too, what I've found is that the more I do this work, the more people who also do this work stand out to me.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had that as well? Like, it's glaring. Like, I meet somebody or I see somebody on TV or whatever, and I'm like, oh, they do that work. And then when I dig into it, I find out, yeah, they do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's something to that.
Yep. I noticed that a lot, and I am more I think it's, there's some confirmation bias in there as well, but confirmation bias when what you're doing is successful is kind of okay anyway. But yeah, I love to have conversations with people who I feel are on the same path as I am in some way. And I'm lucky to be so situated. I mean, doing this show and other things that I do in my life where I meet a lot of those people. And those are the people that seem to be the most prominent in my life, strangely enough, how that works.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's always a reason and a purpose. I remember when I found, long before I founded Entity Seeker Research and Teachings, when Steph and I first met, and this was way back, we were still in grade school. We'd known each other for so long. This was still back in grade school. And I remember seeing her in my class, not knowing any of this stuff at this point in time. And as soon as I saw her, I was like, we're going to be best friends. And I had no idea, like no context for that. It was the first time I'd ever been in this school because it was a brand new school for me and whatever. And it was enough that I went up and started talking to her. And lo and behold, I mean, we formed Entity Seeker together. We did lectures. I mean, she was my sister. And yet there was a deep recognition immediately. It was like, I know I have to be friends with that person. Like, it's so interesting. There is such that deep interconnectedness through all of us.
We had that connection the first time you did Dark Poutine.
Absolutely. And it was, and as soon as we started talking, it was, I knew that about you.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. This is the coolest stuff ever. It just is the coolest stuff ever.
It really is. So thank you, dear listeners, for joining us and my cat Egg on this
fantastic expedition.
And remember, there is no line between the natural and the supernatural. All is consciousness. Until next time, stay curious, friends.
Oh, he's just climbing all over me. Supernatural Circumstances is a co-production of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings and Good Egg Studios. This podcast is part of the Curious Cast podcast network. Theme music by Corey Johnson of Catalyst Records in Edmonton, Alberta. You can learn more about Morgan Knudsen at entityseeker.ca and learn more about me, Mike Brown, and listen to my show, Dark Poutine, at darkpoutine.com. Feel free to email the show at supernaturalcircumstances@gmail.com.